This is Duke University.
I think that this is a wonderful time to discuss and debate and also come together in various interdisciplinary ways. And I hate to start out with some response, which may not be particularly as maybe I should just start with what I want to say. I want to thank him for a wide-ranging, erudite, and stimulating think piece. I have to say that I was surprised to find, John, that it was written by an historian rather than a political philosopher. And I've heard of his other works, and I found this somewhat puzzling in the way in which he tackles this particular project. His elegantly shifting argument so often eschews layered and necessarily limited historical analysis, something that I'm used to and which he might see as very traditional historiography, for more spectacular, and I have to say sometimes reductionist, Western-based generalizations and provocations. There is a way in which he takes a bird's eye view that I think is not always, I think it's a zero-sum game rather than that gray area in between, that nuance in between. I was puzzled by what Devji meant by the humanities in this essay. There was a disconcerting sidestep to the humanities as departments and faculty, quite literally divisionalized in the academy, or the humanities, the impossible impact of the humanities due to the erosion between the private and the public, which I can see very much is the case in Western situations, or its fundamental instability due to the irrelevance or the increasing irrelevance of the humanist subject due to seeing the human race in its singularity as what should be the basis for the humanities. What I missed here was the humanities as multifaceted forms of art and communication, visual, sculptural, verbal, musical, performative, ritualistic, created by individual human beings or human collaboratives. To a very large extent, Devji's essay disregards this latter phenomenon altogether. Theorists, philosophers, and political and social leaders speak here, but artists in the main remain silent. I can echo Devji's implied frustration with the ineffectual hand-wringing over the fate of the university, and I absolutely agree with his astute discussion of its managerial and neoliberal agenda, and also his analyses of the ways in which this agenda is being prosecuted. But I disagree with his negative prognosis for remedial action, prognoses based on the decline of the middle class in one case, which I think privileges, again, Western societies as the mean, and is also the assertion of humanity as posthumous reality. I guess I sort of join J.M. Coetzee in terms of wanting to be in the underground and working towards student interest. That's what I am certainly working for, and so maybe I'm a little bit too close to the ground in this way. I don't think that the artists and their engaged interpreters anywhere in the world, even in the West, would cease doing what they want to do and must do upon receipt of this memo. They did not do so in the early and late scary days of the atomic age, nor did they abandon the redundant language and performance of sacrifice, regardless of Hannah Arendt's prediction. Humans are distinguished not only by their urge to create and analyze and many other terrible things as opposed to good things, but also by their persistent self-centeredness. We short-sightedly invest in our own life experience, our own life work, because it is the only life we have, and we tend not to see beyond that. Devji's think piece primarily dwelled on North American and Western European socio-political scenarios, which he himself acknowledged, and which has always been the case for those of us looking on from the outside. But I very much appreciated his occasional citations of non-North American Western European voices as a means of reassessing traditional Western values and approaches. I found these citations compelling because I myself am a self-centered human, more specifically because of my life's passion for East European literatures and cultures. Devji's speculative argument about the imminent threat to the humanist subject, and I want to change his there for their interior life by the human race, and its negative sacrificial practices, these statements of his prompted me to recall the texts of Polish, Jewish, and Russian poets, fiction writers, memoirists, diarists, essayists, and journalists of the last few centuries, texts I've read and reread and to which I return for sustenance in trying times. And I'm not going to argue that this is in my private life or not. I will just say that this is what I return to. Many of these writers faced erasure or themselves initially espoused their erasure as subject by what seemed to them either morally superior and power-deserving collectives, like the people, the huge percentage of the poor in their nation or their empire, or else they submitted to an erasure by a de-individuating totalitarian repression. But even those who initially consented to their annihilation came to cling to their individual laments, protests, and testimony. Poets such as Wisława Szymborska, Władysław Szlengel, or Marina Tsvetaeva honed in on the complicated desires, simple distractions, and image-rich cultural echoes of the past that made their short moment of living supportable. And for some, that short moment was before their eyes. They wrote to live and to find meaning, however self-delusional, in a grim here and now. Schlegel, one of the last Jews to be killed in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943, knew he was writing into the void, yet he persisted. Other writers, very much like J.M. Coetzee, whom Devji remarks, came to practice and advocate the creation and study of texts as a covert operation, and they attested to this practice through creation and testimony. In their case, the humanities equipped them with a psychological lifeline. There was no question about its marketability or political influence. The poet memoirist Miron Białaszewski labored all his life to capture the heady, horrific experience of the 1944 Warsaw Uprising in prose. That is, the navigation of a city being torched and exploded block by block, the chanting of collective prayers that he loved but didn't really believe in, interrupted by bombs falling on inadequate shelters, the flying university seminars improvised where there were shelters with roofs and a nearby source of water. The memoirist Yevgenia Ginsburg, once an ardent communist, whose ideological fervor was redirected into what I would call a secular humanism during her decades of internment in the Gulag, showed how the recitation of poetry she had memorized, poetry forbidden publication or republication during the high Stalinist years, afforded her an oasis of delight and cerebral renewal against systematized physical and psychological torture. And I would add here, too, thinking about the atomic threat, and I should ask Mark, is it Alexievich? Okay, so Svetlana Alexievich, who is primarily a journalist, but a journalist who really, I would say, is a journalist artist, was able to write in her Voices of Chernobyl, she fashioned a kind of dramatic mosaic of the individual voices of those dying or already annihilated by nuclear catastrophe. Mm-hmm. And that has been her goal in so many of her works. Now, I am not trying to argue that those artists, the part of the world that I've been professing for years and years and years holds any kind of corner on these kinds of texts or these kinds of these cultural products. I am sure that everyone in this room can cite their own set of sustaining texts or films or dramas or music or philosophical reflections. But for me, reflecting on my response to Devji's essay, which I found was quite passionate, as you can tell, I found that I couldn't shut out the voices that I regularly read and listened to. Mm-hmm. The dilemma that I face is not really reconceptualizing the humanities after humanism, but again, self-centered and in the here and now. I'm trying to devise the right strategies to bring more students into contact with these texts, to pry them, in particular in the case of Duke, out of their pre-professional tracks and guide them through my stomping grounds in the global humanities. Thank you.
I was asked to respond, this time with my own voice, so I'll do so. Thank you, Beth, for those comments, and I think I'll return to one of your points at the end of my few remarks. So halfway through his paper, Faisal Devji poses a question about the history of humanity, suggesting that if there's one thing that the humanities have to grapple with, it is surely the transformation of their very subject, which is to say humanity itself as a global fact. It is clear, he writes, that the history of mankind can no longer be confined to the doings of men and women in their multiplicity, but must deal with the fate of the race as a singularity. Well, 19th century thinkers in Europe had produced a number of accounts purporting to be the histories of humanity, often entailing the rise of some race or civilization to global dominance. It was in the 20th, he writes, that the species came to achieve a properly historical reality. These reflections of Faisal's on the writing of the history of humanity led me to reflect in turn on the humanity of history, something that we take for and as a given, but has in fact not always been the case. For history, like so many other professionalizing disciplines of the 18th and especially the 19th century, arrived very much as an imperial knowledge formation in places like in India and other colonies of the European empires. And in that process, as we know, played an important role in delegitimizing and disenfranchising other ways of remembering and recalling the past. In fact, as French historian Pierre Nora's work shows us, this might well have been the role that the discipline played in Europe itself. One has to only remember anthropologist Eric Wolf's magisterial work, Europe and the People Without History, originally published in 1982 and reissued recently in 2010, in which he showed how large parts of the extra-European world were deemed to be without history and hence also without humanity. History, this most humanist of disciplines, has not been particularly kind to all humans. Not surprisingly, a demand among the colonized for the recognition of their fundamental humanity led also to a demand for history. We too must have a history. Our history becomes a resounding call. In places like India, as political theorist Sudipta Kaviraj writes, a culture which had treated history with such indifference suddenly erupts with a great historical discourse. The sound of history, he writes, was everywhere in the air in the 19th century, marching about with great resolution, brutally colonizing the past in ways not dissimilar to the colonization of territories and resources, destroying in the process that which could not be accommodated into what was deemed to be the proper history of mankind. This is the original terror of history, to use Romanian historian of religion Mircea Eliade's felicitous phrase, but in a slightly different way. Consequentially, post-colonial scholars like Ashish Nandi have called, in the name of humanity, for moments of freedom from history. As he argues, millions of people in places like India, but also elsewhere in the global south, living outside disciplinary history, have been disenfranchised and oppressed and dismissed for their inadequate knowledge of history. For these people, the ahistorical mode of being, what Eliade characterized as the eternal, as living in great time or eternal time, is now confined for private or secret use, or for use as forms of fantasy useful in the creative arts. In Nandi's reading, quote, modern historical consciousness is very nearly a totalizing one. Once you own history, it also begins to own you. You can, if you are an artist or a mystic, occasionally break the shackles of history in your own creative or meditative moments. The best you can do by way of exercising your autonomy is to live outside history for short spans of time, end quote. Mahatma Gandhi, the man with whom Faisal ends his reflections on the humanities after humanism, was one such mystic who sought moments, many moments, I would say, of freedom from history. It is one of the supreme ironies of our time that he may well be one of the most historicized of Indians, given the huge disciplinary investment in this founding father of the Indian nation. It's almost like a gatekeeping concept for all of us historians. We have to write about Gandhi in some way or the other. Otherwise, we are not really historians. But among other things, the Mahatma was quite indifferent to the call of history, just as he was, as Faisal tells us in his fascinating and provocative reading, indifferent to the thirst for life that unites all of us as humans. Only by disdaining life could it be saved, Faisal argues, recalling for me a fascinating declaration that Gandhi made on February 27, 1930, on the eve of launching his famous Salt March against British rule. quote, "Not a single believer in nonviolence as an article of faith for the purpose of achieving India's goal should find himself free or alive at the end of the effort." End quote. It is only by refusing to treat his life, indeed all life, as an absolute value that Gandhi is able to spiritualize politics. This reading by Faisal of Gandhi's reckless courage in the face of death, but also in the pursuit of truth with a capital T, recalled for me as well as an argument we heard in this very room a few weeks ago as part of the same FHI series by anthropologist Naisargi Dave, who too asked, and with great provocation, quote, "I wonder what it might look like if we, in the face of challenges, cared a little bit less of our own survival, instead of a full-throated resistance to oblivion, as Judith Butler recently put it." End quote. She ended her talk, if I recall correctly, calling for an ethic of estrangement, a willingness to be strange to oneself and to and with another. In other words, the indifference that we associate with the ethic of strangers. At the very beginning of his paper, Faisal invokes the radical but pessimistic critique of the humanities by Coetzee, which Beth also invoked. But unfortunately, he does not return to connect back to his arguments about Gandhi and the latter's apparent disdain for life. I want to invoke here Coetzee's wonderful, very troubling novel, Elizabeth Costello, 8 Lessons, whose chapter 5 is titled Lesson 5, The Humanities in Africa, which I also recall having a fabulous discussion around at another FHI event. So thanks to the FHI for making all this happen. In a recent reading of that chapter, Catherine Hallemeyer writes, quote, "Of the many lessons that could be read through the humanities in Africa, I suggest that one that is to be learned is how we might reimagine the humanities as a way to live with suffering, rather than as a means to abetting the end of suffering." End quote. If Faisal were here with us today, I would ask him to reflect on what I see as an uncanny similarity between Coetzee's meditation on the humanities and suffering and Gandhi's elevation of suffering, especially self-suffering as a moral ideal and an outcome of his own indifference to life. In the closing moments of the chapter, The Humanities in Africa, Elizabeth Costello, the protagonist, writes to her estranged sister Blanche, quote, "Why can we not speak to each other straight and bare, as people ought who are on the brink of passing?" End quote. In Hallemeyer's reading of the text, Elizabeth and Blanche debate whether the humanities can guide us towards a perfect world less burdened by suffering. A lesson of the humanities in Africa, she argues, is perhaps precisely that this debate may include how the humanities can shake us and so speak to us straight and bare as people ought who are on the brink of passing. End quote. So can the humanities indeed shake us and speak to us straight and bare as people ought who are on the brink of passing? This question leads me not so much to embrace an ethic of indifference, a stance, however conscientious, that fills me with concern, but an ethic possibly of disobedience, another key word in Gandhi's vocabulary, but one that also takes us back half a century earlier and closer to our location here in the US, to Henry David Thoreau, who in his famous essay described civil disobedience as a necessary friction. "Let your life," he writes, "be a counter-friction to stop the machine." These words have been endlessly debated in the scholarship, but I wonder if this indeed is the task or the burden of the humanities in the age after humanism, to be the counter-friction that, if not stops, at least slows down the machine. Thank you.
This is Mustafa Tuna from the Slavic and Eurasian Studies and History. I don't have a question, partly because I don't have someone to ask it to. And I'm not sure if I really know what I'm thinking here too, either. But I'm disturbed. I'm disturbed with a paradox I think I'm observing in what I heard. This seems to be an effort to define humanity by looking at what humanity creates or what we can observe in humans. And we can observe humans only here and now or there and then in profane time, but nobody lives in profane time. What we create is a product of, at the beginning at least, our imagination, and our imagination exists in high time,
High time.
across time. And if we don't take into account, we are not defining humanity. We are not even getting close to what humanity stands for. From one point of view, this includes the bias of positivism and the rejection of religion in defining and describing and studying humanity. But from another point of view, this has the bias of not being able to evaluate what art is, because it's taking out imagination from what art is. So again, it's not a question, but it's just an explanation of what I'm disturbed about.
Are you disturbed about this entire project, this particular panel, or with Devji's essay?
No. What I heard, and also, I mean, it can be taken as a broader disturbance of, about positivism in the, last 2 centuries too. But particularly what I heard, and the absence of this transcendent or high time aspect of what humans are and are doing, and the recognition of the impossibility of observing that, but absence of the recognition of the impossibility of observing that, and choosing not to account for it because we cannot observe it.
But I also thought I was hearing you, Mustafa, say something about how Devji doesn't attend to imagination, right? And I think I was picking that up, Beth, in your comments too. Not that I want to speak for him, but I wonder if he would think that imagination itself is a form of violence. It's a form of violence. And that is the problem. That is my sense of reading the paper as well, a few times. And a form of violence that takes life too seriously, and therefore, I mean, this is the way I read his very complicated reading of Gandhi, right? That actually then leads you to lead a life of violence because we care too much for life.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the way I'm reading this, but...
Sorry. I mean, specifically regarding Gandhi, I don't think that Gandhi disdained life or did not respect life as much as his German interlocutor.
Yeah.
I think he just had a different conception of life, which did not end with death.
Yeah, that is true too. That is absolutely true.
If life is a transition from one form of life to another form of life,
it's a very good point. Yeah.
why try to stop that transition, which is a part of the natural existence that we are in?
Yeah.
I also found it, I mean, again, I think there is reductiveness, and there is, in a sense, a kind of 3 papers in this paper. And so I do think that there's very interesting connections and kind of what I call slate of voice. But when in bringing in an SS officer who's an advisor to Hitler and using him as the interlocutor with Gandhi and talking about, it's a kind of false juxtaposition to say that, again, this man might stand for the valuing of life over all else, which is just absurd. I mean, a hierarchization of who decides who will live or die, or what life is worth something and what life should be exterminated. And so to have Gandhi using, sort of juxtaposing Gandhi with this fellow seems to me, when he talks about injecting in this essay, I don't think about injecting as prolonging life when I think about the Nazis. I think of injecting as extermination. And so it's an odd juxtaposition, and I think it's quite misleading. Sorry, John.
Why, John?
No, John Martin.
Why? Because he wants to.
No.
Okay, I wanted to look at this paper, take a deeper look at the categories which are being utilized in order to make an argument about humanities. So instead of building on it, I just actually want to look at the definitions of humanity and what is considered to be the very purpose of the humanities. That is, it's actually, the essay is very uneven and it questions itself over and over again, but I think there is a certain theme where the cultivation of individuals' interiority is actually being defined as the very purpose of the humanities. And I'm just curious about this emphasis on interiority at the expense of exteriority, which is also a crucial part of, should be a crucial part of our discussion and our cultivation. So a subject actually is not just interiority. There is absolutely, so if we have a conflict, if there is a crisis of a modern subject, then the crisis is not only about interiority, it's actually very much about exteriority, what is happening there. So this is one of the observations, and that's why I have a kind of a similar problem with the concept of erosion between the public and the private, which actually presupposes that there is something, that there are entities that the relationship between which they are being eroded. In fact, I think, okay, well, I want to say that I have been just stepping back, one step back before I talk about erosion. Just this emphasis of an interiority to me is also a symptom and a signal of profound under-theorization of exteriority as an important modern experience, where we're not really looking at relationality between the construction of subjectivity in relation between interior and exterior. We're actually talking about crisis of the private and the private subject, right? Which has a lot of political connotations and consequences for us, as if we actually in terms of, and then the question of this erosion, actually just a continuation, because it actually presupposes the existence of entities between the relationship is being actually eroded. But I think we're really dealing with structural, profound philosophical transformation of kind of meanings and practices, public and private, actually in the West actually carries. And as far as I'm concerned, I think it's not really in the private, but it's actually the public which is in crisis, because the private is everywhere. Like you turn on TV and you turned out and you actually happen to be in the middle of someone's bedroom. And it's not a feature movie. So like you cannot avoid privacy of other people's citizens. Like, so actually it is impossible to find a public space in which you can present yourself as a public, I don't know, being that has interiority. So this is the questions that I wanted to raise that I'm actually looking, as I read, I think that they do remain unquestioned.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Pat Northover, visiting fellow at Duke University. One of the things I found interesting in the conversations stimulated by the talk was a kind of tacit acceptance of the concepts implied in terms of the notion of time, the thing against which death is struggling or becomes a frame against which to think otherwise. So I was wondering whether or not we shouldn't complicate the kind of future anterior notion of time, which is being embedded in that discourse, because I think this is where the notion of the imagination comes in. Because it's really contested temporalities and different imaginations of temporalities and how that is stitched into particular kinds of social relationships. And so different notions of temporality carry different notions of sociality. So to the extent that we have an engagement with a critique of a particular notion of temporality and its social, then I think we need to be able to see that, that's a construct that can be turned in different ways by having different imaginaries about what constitutes the temporal. But I also wanted to say that there's something embedded notion of death as being a certain, what I was kind of surprised at in the discourse is Nietzsche wasn't at any point in time mentioned, and it just seemed to be a kind of unfolding of Nietzschean thought. And the principle of Nazism is really a search for the overman, that notion of the human, which is in excess of it, and carries with it a new raciology, a potential being which doesn't really need man. And so that carries a really wild imaginary, which really requires avoiding of the very things that humanism is dependent on. And I think there is an alternative set of imaginaries that contest that. And I think part of the imaginaries that contest that are the ones which have been absolutely unassimilable to that model. Not only the Jewish body, but the Black body, and the ways in which the Black body has been persistently, in a sense, the border that both enables this vision, but also doesn't, is not integratable, you know? So those bodies have had to live outside of the Nietzschean concept to some extent, to the extent that they don't partake of that history in any level of the constitution of how that history imagines its future. You know, so I would just throw that out in terms of complicating the ways in which we're thinking through this idea of temporality.
So do you think the Superman lives in the high time that Mustafa was alluding to? And you know, Faisal at one point has this notion of the spatiality folding into time. So I was wondering if that's what, you know, Mustafa, you were thinking about when you said high time, that you think the humanities also needs to attend to something called high time, which is sort of floating up above, right?
I mean, it's a response to Charles Taylor's secularism too. It's not about religion, it's about time, here and now. And that's not where I am. I mean, as I'm sitting in this room right now, I'm thinking about something that happened 10 years ago, or I can think about my concerns 10 years from now. Actually, we are all concerned about 10 years from now. That's why we are here.
I thought that Devji's idea of moving beyond a spatial public and private was incredibly valuable. But in these comments, one realizes that we should be thinking also about private and public time. How is time public through historicization? How is it private through a notion of a resistance to death, through a notion of an eternal on a spiritual level? One thing that I found surprising in the paper, though, was the unexamined discussion of species, because it seems to me that we're living in a moment of such intense biological interrogation of any likeness of human biology. In other words, at what point does the human diverge into other, how should we consider the microbiome, for example, as a new idea of the human? How should we consider the chimera? All of these hybrids in biology, I think, are putting into question the degree to which humanism can be based on any kind of a solid idea of what the human is.
Not to mention all the insights from animal studies, which is also problematizing the human-animal distinction. Yeah, Elizabeth Costello again, right?
He loves the Anthropocene, but
He does, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I wasn't sure how exactly the proposal to move beyond the spatial understanding of private and public forces us to rethink the relationship between interiority and exteriority. So I would this is something that I'm actually thinking quite actively, because it's a proposition that actually doesn't follow through in our thinking than what happened to humanities if we move this kind of step. And that was very surprising when actually in the middle of the paper, the ultimate goal of humanities is still being restated as interiority. So I was just very surprised.
What was striking to me in this very rich paper and in the responses was the slippage between different senses of the humanities or different objects. The humanities as an academic discipline, the humanities as a mode of production, what we call the arts, the humanities as a name for race, and then the humanitarian as our response to certain certain violence done to other human beings. I think this slippage actually is both very productive. It allows it puts into motion a set of associations, but it also I think is concealing or veiling the true nature of the attack on humanities as or the critique on humanities as an academic discipline. And also, it's in response to your last comments as a mode of resistance, of disobedience, of alienation. I think that's precisely the core of the critique of the humanities, the neoliberal critique on the humanities is precisely in the changed perception of how the humanities function, not only within the university, but in relation vis-a-vis the states, vis-a-vis the polity. Of the change from producing state subjects, ideal subjects, technocrats, to a mode of resisting or resistance to that state. I think this slippage actually takes us away from addressing that critique, which is, I mean, actually the critics are quite right in their critique and justified. Universities have changed their vision of what they should do vis-a-vis the state, and we are not addressing that. Whether I agree with that critique or not, that's beside the point. But they are actually arguing that we should not be privileged in addressing the different kinds of humanities we've been talking about here. Perhaps they are protecting these other humanities from our interpretation of humanities, of the humanities, of the alienation, the sense of alienation we inject into the discussion. They argue that it is unhealthy from the polity.
When you say they, are you talking about
Neoliberal critique or political critique of the humanities? I think we have to take that. I take that critique seriously because I think historically it's not wrong. It's not off the mark. Whereas all these attempts to protect the humanities in terms of age or ideals are historically off the mark in terms of at least the history of this institution.
You know, I am actually very interested in continuing to develop this notion of the humanities as friction, you know, because friction carries both a positive and a negative meaning, right? And I see Jules nodding very vigorously, so please jump in, right? Because it both enables the working of the machine, so you're inside the machine, but you're also could be pushing back at it. So it's actually, I was thinking, and this is really, you know, very spur of the moment kind of ideas that I put together, like you last night and this morning, thinking about this paper.
Don't reveal my secret.
About what we do really in the world, right? And, or at least what I do and what I'm very proud of, that I am actually, I cannot deny it, I'm part of the machine, but really, you know, but also sort of off kilter with the machine, right? And I think that's a very important role that I think we play, no? And you're saying that that is actually what whoever they are accusing us of, right? But I think we should defend it. I think it's good to be this kind of necessary friction, no?
But I
think the missing character is not Nietzsche. Sorry, I think the missing character is not Nietzsche, but Heidegger.
Heidegger, of course.
As one who addresses the question of the humanities vis-a-vis the polity,
right?
Between collaboration and critique.
Right. No, that's excellent. Thank you for that. Yes.
But I was going to say, in response to you, Shai, and that's something that I perhaps am not fair to Devji in terms of, I mean, because he had basically an open card to write a think piece about global humanities, about, you know, how he sees this fitting, and then took it from there. And it starts out with this critique and the hand-wringing about the university, but that hand-wringing has become very redundant and a little bit, it doesn't seem to progress beyond that. But I do think that that is an essential conversation that has to be, that we need to pursue. And what you say about friction, or what, I, as a department chair, spend half of my waking life justifying why my department exists and why courses should be taught, and explaining to students why these are important to them. And so again, this issue of being able, and I think of it as much more as subversion, because saying friction often, if my students are subverted into or seduced into my courses and then learn these, if they are subversive, they have to be subversive, because it will go against whatever track they see themselves progressing on. But it has to be done with different kinds of strategies, and we need to discuss those. Maybe not in a way of saying it has to be, because that then buys into this notion of what a well-groomed young woman or man coming from Duke is, and that's what the trustees want. That's what that's what the university wants, and we don't want that. We want something very, very different.
I love this conversation because it reminds me, as very few conversations do at Duke, that we're not purely a university that's concerned with instrumentality and pre-professionalism. These are wonderful questions, but I wanted to pose a very prosaic question from the point of view of someone who works on a much earlier historical period than the 19th century. And I was a bit surprised by Devji's paper in light of the way he used the word humanism and tended to blend the word humanism with humanities.
Yeah.
And in fact, if we think about a post-humanist moment, it might open up a space for reimagining the humanities without tethering the humanities to humanism as a project. In the Renaissance, there was no concept of humanism. There was, however, a concept of the study of what was called humanitas. How we would translate that is extraordinarily difficult question. There were ideas in the Renaissance about humankind that were represented in various ways, but that wasn't the question. It seems to me that it's a 19th and 20th century project that begins to align humanism with the humanities. What's interesting to me to think about, Deborah talked about post-disciplinary humanities. We could also talk about pre-disciplinary humanities. So humanism has, as a project connected to the humanities, coincided in the 19th and 20th century with disciplinary culture. Prior to the 18th century, certainly in the 15th and 16th century, humanists, if we call them that, were engaged with the natural sciences, with astronomy, with geography. There was no strict division between textual study and philology, cartography and astronomy. These were disciplines, we call them disciplines, but they interrelated in a variety of ways. And it feels to me that, in a way, if we're in a post-humanist moment, we can unburden the humanities from making immense claims that they're offering a particular perspective on the world and allow them to flourish as a multifaceted, post-disciplinary, multidisciplinary conversation. There might be in that friction, there might be resistance, there might be esotericism and ways of resisting the machine, but there will also be collaboration, and there will also be things that I would deplore, because I think that humanities...
What would you deplore, John?
I would deplore a lot of Nazis were great humanists.
All right.
It's not, I don't think humanities I know I have a lot of colleagues, and I will engage you in this conversation. I do not think the humanities make people better necessarily. I think the humanities allow us to expand our vision of the complexity of life, of humanity. I also love the idea of humanities as a repository of memory, that there is that. And this is, not to, interiority, I'm totally on board with Anna's critique of overemphasizing that. But there is something to be said, I believe, for memory, for poetry, for what one brings into one's internal life. I'm just not convinced it always makes a person more moral or more ethical. A lot has been done in the world that's harmful by people who are well-trained humanists, who should have known better. All of us.
Sounding like Faisal and Gandhi now.
Yes, no, but we do. I mean, I think that's, but I don't, I think I think it would be interesting. I mean, I was thinking Humanities After Humanism would be a space where we might retrieve a much more capacious and richer view
And
of
also
what humanities
a
is,
darker view as well.
without tying it to a particular imperial or philosophical project. And I think that could be quite liberating for the humanities. So I'm just suggesting that I think this distinction between humanism and the humanities is one that we should keep at the forefront of our conversation, because it's a particular moment in primarily Western history that conflates the two, humanities and humanism. And it was a fleeting moment that lasted about 200 years, and thank God it's over.
But I would, I agree with you, John, but I think that it's also has lasted much longer in the minds of administrators, not our administrators, but
Not our
but in
Never.
certainly not in those who are in the House, but in a kind of corporate mentality. And I have to say that I have students who say, this course will make me a better person. And I said, no, this course will make you a more informed person. It will open you to other people who may not be people you particularly, I mean, you will learn various things about them, but it will not be something that will make you good. It's such a Victorian ideal that the humanities will in some way cultivate you and make you a civilized person with the right kinds of values.
Well, I mean, I would think I do think there are signs of that even much earlier in the idea that a humanistic education could make you a better person. I mean, even Cicero has this notion in antiquity.
I know what Cicero was like, yeah.
But I do think that there is I do think that there is. I mean, it sort of fits in with the paper we heard this morning. That I think once the humanities assumes the mantle of a civilizational program, that it's in a lot of trouble. And that in a university, we need to create multiple spaces for different kinds of humanistic inquiry that allow different forms of thinking that are cross-disciplinary, but that are also disciplinary. And that if we do that, we don't have to think all the time that there is a particular ideological project embedded in the diversity of the activities that take place under the guise of humanities. And I think that would liberate us to have multiple voices, multiple questions, multiple ways of thinking. And we professors are sometimes, I think, strapping ourselves into very narrow seats because we invest so much in the humanities having a particular ideological outcome.
Well, we have to translate it into political terms.
Yeah.
I mean, it has to have political currency. Yeah.
Jules, did you have your hand up? Ah, okay.
I'm just thinking about this in the context of the undergraduate experience and how to make complexity something desirous and without making it instrumental, right? And so how do you say these are skills? I mean, even starting to put language to it is really complicated.
Right.
As well as then also finding a space in which they can grapple with at a kind of nascent level how to start thinking in this way, how to take authority. We demand a lot of them as emerging scholars in a different way. It's different structures that we go about opening up the investigation. And that's daunting, I think, to them too. It's a way of thinking and a way of approaching intellectual life that is hard and complex, and the outcome isn't always clear. And that's the joy and pleasure for most of us that do it. But I think it's the kind of terror and resistance in emerging scholars. So, I was trying to think about how to message better without marketing, which is a very slippery space. And also how to complicate, but still offer them a light, right? So that they can pursue, because other places will say, whether true or not, that there's a light or that's a space, and you will they are happy to embrace the instrumental. So how to not do that, but also not seem like you're not offering anything or no way to kind of come to a culmination.
Interesting.
I think that if you look at the way that the French Revolution was constructed around ideas of private and public, it is true that our whole notion of the state and of the role of critique is somewhat in crisis in the dissolution of the public that Anna was speaking about. I was thinking about things like Facebook and the way that marketing and commercial forces follow, the traces of our words in Gmail. There's this embeddedness of public and private and a slippage of where the target of critique might be. And that, I think, is really key to the historicization of our ideological terrain at this moment, that a static external idea of the state, of totalitarianism, is becoming almost irrelevant at a certain level, and instead, in that dissolution of the public into the private and the private into the public, there is an enormous challenge of critique, but one that is so new. It's being approached in media studies, for example, but we really need to bring it back into the more textual fields that have tended to dominate the humanities.
Ellen Mickiewicz, Public Policy and Political Science, and media interests. It seems to me that the private and the public have been thoroughly interpenetrated and have been for some time. I think it's frankly a false dichotomy. I think Habermas I think one pays due respect to him, but in fact, you cannot derive hypotheses from him. So if you accept that, and especially with the coming of the internet, I think it's incontestable. Facebook announces what it will use your personal information for. You do it, you enter it. If you think that the value to you is greater than the loss of that information. When you're a senior in college, you start scrubbing it so that your future possible employers won't know what a mischievous person you were in university, and thus not hire you. Of course, it's no such thing as scrubbable, but I think that on the other hand, there is such an exploding universe of possibilities of communication on the internet, both in personal terms with some unseen individual, perhaps, which can create the passenger effect where you are more open with someone you will never see again as someone who sits next to you on a plane. That the real question, it seems to me, is how do you navigate it? What do you choose? How do you express whatever it is that you consider private or public? To whom? To what site? How do you know? In the beginning of the internet, and I'll stop here, there was a surely, clearly impossible project that various foundations would support that would give labels to sites on the internet. This one it has integrity. That one is biased. Well, the world has outpaced that. So I think the real question for the future is not so much what you choose, but do you know, the various dimensions of what you choose and the interactivity with you, your world, and your future, and the world at large, and security concerns when you're investigated for that job you want. But secondly, also, beyond I will get out of it at what cost, is the question of how on earth do I navigate an ocean that has no boundaries and that is growing all the time.
I would like to return to this notion of singular humanity, because on the one hand, of course, it seems to be counterintuitive. We are trying to avoid generalizations. We are trying to go to very much specific subjectivities and avoid talking about greater masses. But on the other hand, there is certain important aspect that this paper suggests, and these issues were touched. I've just read this forecast of the, I don't remember, director or president of Google for the next century. And it's quite interesting, because he basically says that in 50 years we'll have artificial intelligence, and by the end of the century, due to nanotechnology and what's not, the actual immortality would be achieved, which is a huge challenge for entire human culture, because our culture is based on the idea of mortality. Yeah. And whatever we know is based on this premise. So envisioning this radical change, and of course maybe it will even come earlier when our brains will be scanned and we all will transform after our physical death into software, which can be achieved. And here we can talk about private and public, right? Will it require a passport or not? That's my question.
And who will remember it?
Right.
Serious, and who will remember it, right?
And the horror.
But what I'm talking about is that I don't know if our administrations would hear this argument, but we certainly should think about it. So we are on the brink of the very radical transformations of human cultures, global and not global. And I believe that this situation will shift the emphasis from technology per se to humanities and humanistic reconfigurations. In this respect, I believe that humanities might sort of reassume the function, old and new function, being the laboratory of utopia. And we spent 50 years at least in Slavic studies fighting with the traces of utopia and analyzing why utopia is so destructive. But these lessons, they need to be incorporated, and utopias of the new designs of human culture can be, as we understand, built only on the scholarly, scientific understanding of how culture functions and what are its dangers and what are other things that we're learning from history. So utopia can be only historically based. So if, of course, I'm not talking about transformation of all humanities into one futurological lab, but this dimension might be very, very important and very exciting, I guess, for our students and graduate students. Because seriously, when we'll face this, they will come to us and ask about the ethics of, I don't know, robots, things that science fiction was discussing back in the 50s and 60s, but now it's becoming a pragmatic matter, and how to deal with scanned minds and how to deal with life without death. So all these things have to be thought through national cultures, national traditions, their contemporary configurations, interactions. So these are the age of humanities that we need to sort of declare coming and to need to trumpet our huge global function, and probably that's the moment to it.
Do you think we could use Google?
For what?
For the trumpeting.
Of course,
Okay.
of course. Of course. Yeah. We should use Facebook, definitely.
Well, thank you so much, Beth and Sumathi, and Faisal in his absence, but that was a very provocative.
And thanks to all of the people who contributed to this.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.